Walk me through, for the basic person, what is ocean acidification?
Yeah. So as humans burn fossil fuels, we put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And more than 25% of that carbon dioxide, more than a quarter of that carbon dioxide, ends up in the ocean. So think of that since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, at the end of the 1800s, we've been pumping carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and all that is ending up in the surface ocean. And a lot of that, as it ends up in the surface ocean, it literally changes ocean chemistry. So the ocean is becoming more acidic, and as it becomes more acidic, it's more corrosive to organisms like oysters that build shells. It makes it harder for oysters to build shells, which has impacts on oyster hatcheries. It makes it harder for salmon to find their way home, to sniff their way home. It has a bunch of cascading impacts all through the marine ecosystems and on marine life.
So far from the research, does it appear that this is a very new process? Could this have been happening for hundreds of years?
Yeah, so the chemistry of carbon in the atmosphere ending up in the ocean and making it more acidic, that is as old as chemistry itself. We understand that process really, really well. But what's different is in the last 150 years, we put a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So sort of think of that year in, year out, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it's ending up in the oceans. We're really accelerating this process, causing this process to happen because of so much fossil fuel emissions.
You did kind of touch on this, but what does the water becoming more acidic mean for some of the organisms that are really central to industries and fisheries here in the Puget Sound area?
Yeah, so as that carbon enters the ocean, it makes it more acidic, it makes it more corrosive, it makes it harder for organisms like oysters to build their skeletons, to build their shells. That has impacts on oyster hatcheries. It makes it harder for salmon and other organisms to smell their way home. It has a lot of impacts on the marine life that we love, that pays the bills, that has deep cultural significance. So really, ocean acidification has impacts all through the Puget Sound, Salish Sea, and throughout the whole ocean.
And you've really been studying its impacts on coral. Why is coral a good microcosm for these types of organisms? What can coral maybe tell us about the impacts of ocean acidification over the years?
Yeah, so corals are some of the most sensitive organisms to ocean acidification, and so they're really sort of the canary in the coal mine. They can give us this first look at how ocean acidification is going to change lots of different organisms, lots of different marine life. And so the corals are crucial for marine ecosystems throughout the world, but what a lot of people don't know is we have corals right here in the Pacific Northwest. In fact, you think of vibrant, beautiful coral reefs from, if you're lucky to have gone to see corals, or maybe someone sent you a postcard, but we have corals very similar to those right here in the Pacific Northwest, bright orange cup corals that divers love, that we find all through Puget Sound, Salish Sea, and along the west coast. And so studying whether we're studying the native corals or corals out in the tropics, they can give us an indication of how organisms respond to ocean acidification, how they build their skeletons, how that process of shell forming is being impacted.
So could we potentially learn how fast ocean acidification is impacting organisms?
Yeah, so one of the really cool things that we've been doing in the lab here is working with these native cold water corals from the Pacific Northwest. And as they grow, they capture information about the ocean around them as they grow. And so we are lucky to have corals from 150 years ago in our lab. And the story of how we got them is really cool. Actually, one of the first research vessels that the United States had, the research vessel Albatross, sailed along the west coast in the 1890s, and they were looking for halibut fisheries, but along the way they pulled up a bunch of corals and they sent them away to a museum, and they didn't know sort of how important and influential they would be, but they were literally taking time capsules of ocean chemistry from the dawn of the Industrial Revolution that now we have 150 years later been able to make measurements from and understand just how much impact humans have had, just how much chemical changes we've caused in the Pacific Northwest. The really big question is, what is ocean acidification going to look like in the future? How's it going to impact us? What are the ways that we can anticipate and maybe even mitigate some of those changes? And so to do that, we need to know how quickly ocean acidification is happening so we can anticipate it. And so being able to look back in time, these corals let us literally look back in time and reconstruct how ocean acidification has happened over the last 150 years can help us understand what to expect in the future. And what I'd what I'd like to add to that is like what I think is so cool about Mary Margaret's project, right? Is she brings together this project brings together history. We're working with corals that were collected 150 years ago. She then makes measurements in labs like this that are, with state-of-the-art chemical equipment, and then she combines that with models. Literally, supercomputers have been cranking day and night to be able to make predictions about how to take this information and make forecasts about what we can expect for ocean acidification. So it's a really, from a scientific perspective, it's bringing together all these really cool tools to try to answer the million-dollar question: what is ocean acidification going to look like in the future? How can we anticipate that? What are we going to do about it? By understanding the pattern and pace of ocean acidification, we can know where to put our conservation resources to best protect the marine ecosystems that we value. It can also help us understand where to invest in infrastructure to mitigate the changes, right? Both long-term projections like the ones we work on and shorter-term projections like colleagues of mine work on can help oyster hatcheries anticipate when ocean acidification is going to happen, and they can make changes in actually how they operate the hatcheries or where they plan to build new infrastructure. Right? So being armed with an idea of what the future is going to look like can really help us plan appropriately. When I'm really close to the research on climate change, and because of that, we're really familiar with what the predictions are. And sometimes it can be overwhelming to see what those predicted changes are and how much impact that might have on the things that the natural world that we love around us. And what I take from that, or what sort of gives me the power to think about how to move forward with that, is recognizing that we all have a role we have space to make a difference, right? So it's how much carbon is in the atmosphere makes the most difference for climate change, global warming, and for ocean acidification. And all of us through our daily lives contribute to carbon emissions. And that can be both overwhelming, but also it's a place of power. We have the opportunity through reducing our carbon emissions to make a difference. And yes, it's true that in sort of the industrial world, we emit more carbon per person than other people on the planet, but that gives us the potential to make a really big difference, because if we cut back our carbon emissions, then we can have an outsized impact on making the future better.
There are many factors that can contribute to ocean acidification in a certain area. So the impact of the oceans absorbing carbon dioxide, so that traditional human-induced acidification is happening all over the world. But there are some factors in other areas that are kind of exacerbating acidification, such as the Salish Sea. So there are some natural processes that are happening off the coast of Washington, actually along the entire west coast of the United States, that bring naturally acidic water up from depth to the surface and into the Salish Sea. So acidification is kind of compounded because of all of those factors. But yeah, I mean, and thinking about impacts in the Salish Sea too. So ocean acidification over the past century has really started to threaten Washington's marine wildlife and ecology. So in the Salish Sea, ocean acidification is impacting the growth of mussels, oysters, and clams. And those organisms are food sources for seabirds, salmon, and many other marine organisms. And kind of because of that interconnected nature of impacts, ocean acidification affects the health of the entire marine ecosystem, but also people. So ocean acidification is threatening commercial fisheries and shell fisheries, and other cultural and recreational activities that occur in and around the Salish Sea. So kind of for all of those reasons, the fact that the Salish Sea is kind of naturally acidified, but there are so many human factors, societal impacts, environmental impacts, all happening in the same area. It's kind of, the Salish Sea is sitting at the leading edge of ocean acidification impacts, and because of that, it kind of provides a window into future changes that might be happening in other areas in the coming decades, right? Yeah, so kind of at this point, we understand that studying ocean acidification in the Salish Sea is really important to protect these marine ecosystems and adapt to changes coming in the future. And kind of one way that we can study our role as humans in future acidification is to look back at our role in past acidification. So kind of rewinding to the early 1900s, before the Industrial Revolution, kind of before we started burning fossil fuels at a large scale, we really want to know how much seawater chemistry has changed over the past century because of those activities. So here at UW, we are studying that question using a cold water coral that actually grows natively along the Washington coast. And these historic corals kind of serve as time capsules of past ocean chemistry. These corals were collected, before the Industrial Revolution, before we started burning fossil fuels, and before the ocean started absorbing that carbon dioxide. So these corals kind of provide a glimpse into that baseline level of ocean chemistry before we started impacting the chemistry. So in our lab, we have a number of corals that, again, were collected in the late 1800s. They kind of, again, serve as those time capsules, mini time capsules of past ocean chemistry. And to measure how much the seawater chemistry has changed over the past century, we can compare those historic corals that were collected before the Industrial Revolution with modern corals that we actually collected in 2020 from the same locations in the Salish Sea aboard UW's research vessel, the Rachel Carson. So with both historic and modern corals, we can learn more about our role as humans in ocean acidification, but also better understand the pace of acidification over the past century to inform future changes in the Salish Sea.
And is that research ongoing, or have you had any findings so far?
Still ongoing, but we are wrapping up the project a bit. So we actually used a really cool combination of those corals, the chemistry locked in the coral skeletons, with a model of chemical changes from 1900 to today. We're kind of synthesizing those results right now, working on the paper for it. So, but yeah, some really, really cool research and some cool tools all coming together to study this question.